and we have about 1 hour and a half for this panel discussion. First of all, I wish we had some kind of PET scan or brain imaging technique so I could show you what's happening right now in my brain, or my mind for that matter. I bet it would be pretty spectacular. I mean, I can imagine neurons firing all around the place, neurotransmitters being sent over, and I guess this would be a nice testimony to my present state of mind, which is a mixture of excitement, being here in this prestigious venue with such prestigious panelists. It's a rare privilege, of course. And also it would probably be an expression of my nervousness. For one thing, I'm not sure why I was chosen as a moderator. Is it because I'm a philosopher, as Dr. Elie mentioned earlier? Is it because I'm French? Or because I'm a French philosopher, which makes things worse. You know that French philosophers have a very bad reputation of being skeptically minded, to put it mildly. Not only are they do they bear the heritage of Descartes, who was mentioned earlier, but they're also strong skeptics, and sometimes they're sarcastic as soon as it comes to dealing, with phenomena that seem to point to a sphere of reality, the mind, which cannot be that easily explained away as a mere byproduct of brain circuitry. Not to speak of the spiritual dimension of the whole affair. Well, I'm not that kind of Frenchman. I think I am fairly open-minded to a certain extent. And it's, of course, my pleasure to moderate a discussion panel on the mind-body problem with speakers whose research, I think, and this is true in different ways, does not fit very easily in the current paradigm, which is more or less a direct consequence of the way Descartes framed the problem. Dr. Parnia mentioned it in his talk. And I guess we could say that the dominant materialist stance on the issue of mind-body connections is a consequence of the way Descartes very starkly opposed two substances, the mind on the one hand and matter on the other hand. These two spheres of reality being, you could say, heterogeneous, like two different natures, two different kinds of stuff that do not communicate in a simple way. The materialist move was very simple. Once you've separated the two substances, well, you can drop one of them and try to account for everything in terms of matter. I think we're still caught into that way of framing the mind-body problem. And again, I think it's something that is really particular to this venue, this symposium. The people, the speakers who you're going to hear are all of them, or most of them, I should say, medical doctors. Well, they have a medical formation. And I think most of them were led to psychoneurology, to neuroscience generally, through an intensive clinical practice. So it means that they share a very concrete, very, I was going to say down to earth, but that's not the proper way. They have a very concrete perspective or take on these issues, on the mind-body problem. And of course, when I say clinical, it means also interacting with patients, with people who, as was mentioned earlier, who went through intense experiences of near death, for example, and similar experiences. And this, of course, I mean, this specific orientation towards the way these things are experienced by people, by real people, makes a difference, I think. But let me say first a few words about what strikes me as the distinctive approach, intellectual approach of our speakers. Traditionally, the debates concerning the mind-body problem have revolved around one big question. And this question is, how does the body, or the brain for that matter, generate consciousness? And this is sometimes called the hard problem. The hard problem of consciousness is that you can account for many things, many parts, many aspects of the activity, of mindful activity, but consciousness itself, the fact that you feel that I have an experience of some kind, the sort of qualitative feel of that experience is something that is very hard to explain away in terms of neuronal circuitry or whatever you want. So the question again is, how does the brain generate consciousness? And also, does it generate consciousness? Well, in this respect, I think a spiritualist view on the matter or a materialist view are more or less running along the same lines. In both cases, it's a matter of explaining consciousness or showing that it cannot be explained based on brain matters. And again, this is, I think, a consequence of the way Descartes framed the problem, because these two spheres of reality seem so different that it doesn't really make sense to say that the one can produce the other, just as, for example, steam is produced by a tea kettle. You know, it seems that there's something unacceptable in this production scheme. And of course, I think even hardcore materialists, or self-proclaimed hardcore materialists, have a difficult time resisting the kind of astonishment that comes from, you know, considering the idea that this grey pack of cells produces something as ineffable, as wonderful as consciousness. And their strategy in most cases has been to counterattack with an even more astonishing hypothesis. And I'm referring, of course, to Francis Crick's Nobel Prize winner, Francis Crick's astonishing hypothesis, as he says, which is that we're a bag of neurons, little flesh and bones around it, and that's it. And that the very problem of consciousness, the hard problem, as I said, is an illusion, is something that we should get rid of. So it seems the current discussion is squeezed between two equally paralyzing positions or stances. On the one hand, you have the astonishing hypothesis that consciousness is nothing much, that doesn't matter, in fact, that much. And the other stance is to insist on the hard problem of consciousness and to continuously come back to this explanatory gap, you know, that prevents us from having like simple causation between one sphere or one substance and the other. And on this side of the matter, there are really two responses. Once you accepted the hard problem as a genuine problem, either you say, and that's I think that's a dominant view. Either you say that, well, let's try and solve the easy problems first. Well, let's keep the hard problem for later, when we are retired and we have time for philosophy. Let's solve the easy problem. Let's use brain imaging techniques to show what the neural correlates of various mindful activities are. See how it works. Try and explain the details. And the big thing, the big question, the big picture, either we leave that to philosophers, French or otherwise, or we just simply don't address it, which is a solution. The other response would be to say that consciousness is a mystery that must forever evade scientific models of explanation. But then this solution raises the suspicion that, in fact, the very notion of consciousness may be not precise enough. Maybe something like the sky for today's astronomers. They don't talk about the sky anymore. Or take biologists. They don't talk that much about life per se. They talk about various functions, biological functions, and they go into the details of the mechanisms underpinning life, but they don't talk and they don't address life as such as a problem. If you do that, again, you have a position, and that's not very good for a scientist, I believe. So again, I must emphasize here that the particular perspectives of our various participants, various speakers and panelists, implies, I think, in different ways, again, a shift in the focus of current discussions on mind-body problem. I already mentioned the fact that they're all more or less related to clinical practice. Maybe they're not involved anymore, but at some point there were, and this again makes a difference. They have a very practical take on the issues. And as a result, I would say that they're interested in the pragmatics of consciousness. They're asking really not so much what is consciousness. You could always ask this question, but it's so big, it's so huge that you have a hard time finding the right grips. I think what they're interested in basically is what does consciousness do? Not so much what is its nature, but what does it do? How does it operate? And I should add maybe the question, the more essential question would be, what can it do for us? How can it make our lives, ourselves, better lives and better selves? So this pragmatic bent, which by the way I think is also common to Ustad Elahi's own approach of the underpinnings of spiritual life. It was mentioned in Dr. Ibrahim Elahi's introduction. This pragmatic approach to matters relating to mind, the spiritual realm, etc., is, I think, a distinctive trait of today's symposium. I think the interesting thing is, of course, that once you start with the question, what does consciousness do? The tables are turned on materialism, because the question is not so much how does consciousness emerge from the brain, how the brain produces consciousness. It's really how does consciousness shape the brain. You reverse the question. And why not start with this question? It's as empirical, as pragmatic, as scientific as the other one. And this naturally leads us to ask another, maybe more fundamental question, which is how can, in principle, such a thing as consciousness cause brain events or cause material changes in general? Let me say that we're not going to address this fundamental question first, beforehand. We will at some point in the discussion, but I think it's better to start with the first question: what does it do? Stressing the pragmatics of the mind-body problem is already a way to escape or to go beyond the traditional mind-body problem. You know, the thing you learn when you take Mind 101 or when you read a philosophy book. Again, what can we do about our brains? I think we'll start with that kind of question. And then, of course, we can address the fundamental question, which implies going into the details of the kind of causation that you can imagine between these two spheres. I'm saying spheres because I don't have a better word, because I don't want to talk about substances or entities too quickly, at least. This afternoon, we will address another issue, which is how can we reach beyond, not so much beyond the mind-body problem, but beyond the brain itself. It was already clear in Dr. Parnia's talk, the evidence of near-death experience raises delicate questions concerning what we might call brain-dead states of consciousness. Consciousness without brain, or with a dead brain. This panel, this morning panel, again, is more focused on the very issue of mind-body connections. So, I guess my first question, in order to start the discussion, will be addressed to Mario Beauregard. You know, it was mentioned that he's an investigator in the Human Consciousness Project for the University of Montreal. I should say that he's also a sort of general investigator for this very symposium, because as you may have realized, he'll be talking in both panels. This is a rare privilege. And he's, of course, an expert in the field of neuroscience, and especially in issues that concern the spiritual side of the brain. I'm referring to to the book he co-authored called The Spiritual Brain, which is really a wonderful synthesis of almost all the questions that arise today in the field of neuroscience and beyond. So my first question for you would be, it's twofold really. The first is I'd like you to tell us a little bit how your research, or how the kind of research that you document in your book and that we will be talking about today is perceived in academic, institutional terms by your colleagues. Is it easy to raise the kind of question you raise? And to what point is there an embarrassment in the scientific community? And how would you explain it? What are the reasons for that? But that's one question. The other question, well, I'll ask later. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would say that it depends of where you're presenting your research, you know, in which milieu. And it also depends on the specific cultures associated with the various academic institutions. So I'll give you an example. In Montreal, we have two different cultures, an Anglophone culture and a Francophone culture. I'm a French Canadian, and I'm at University of Montreal. So it's the second largest French university in the world after Paris. We have a very famous institution in Montreal, which is McGill University. It's called the Harvard of the North, you know, as you know. And so a few years ago, when I decided to do a project with the Carmelite nuns funded by the Templeton Foundation, two of the studies were supposed to be conducted at University of Montreal, but a third one was supposed to be conducted at McGill University, at the famous Montreal Neurological Institute founded by Penfield in the late 20s. And this project was supposed to involve PET scanning to examine what's going on with regard to a chemical messenger in the brain, which is related to all sorts of functions. It's called serotonin. It's very much involved in mood regulation, but it's also involved in various spiritual states, mystical states. So we asked their permission to use their PET scan to do this project over there, and it's been absolutely rejected. And whereas at University of Montreal, the two projects presented were welcomed. Because they were at University of Montreal, the researchers thought that it was very pioneering, very innovative, very new and exciting, and the questions were considered to be worthy of scientific investigation. At McGill University, I've been told in later that neuroscience and spirituality and religion shouldn't have anything to do, and that one of the members of the committee was a very famous neuroscientist over there. I'm not going to mention her name, but she's known all around the world. And she even studied with Penfield in the 60s, and some of you may know her. And she said, as long as I'm here, you know, on this committee, the PET working committee over there, there's never going to be any study about neuroscience and religion or spirituality in my place, you know. So that illustrates the, you know, the difference of view regarding this question. So it depends of, you know, on where you are. But in general, it's very polarized. So the reaction is that for some of the, a minority of colleagues, they think that it's very important to do this new kind of research, which at the same time tackles the mind-body problem, and also it shows all the shortcomings, the limitations of the materialist view. So I would say this is for a minority of my colleagues who dare to say that publicly. But in reality, many more people, many more colleagues send me emails or have secret discussions with me saying that it's time for a major paradigm shift in neuroscience, but since we are only a minority of maverick scientists at this point, it's not possible yet to reverse the old paradigm, but a lot of young neuroscientists are very encouraged to go in that direction, but they're still afraid of having trouble to get research funding, to get a position at university. And So, because honestly, the field is still controlled by the old guard, and the old guard still believes in the the old doctrine that the mind is what the brain does, and that you can reduce all spiritual, mystical experiences to simply electrical and chemical processes in the brain. So there's a battle. It's like a cultural war, if you want. But we're making progress slowly. But I'm sure that in 10 or 20 years from now, things will change dramatically, especially if we can receive, important funding to do these type of studies. And interestingly, more and more private foundations are open to these questions in Europe and also in the United States.
Thank you. Well, I guess in 10 years you could publish these secret emails and make a book out of it. Maybe Dr. Sternberg would like to react to this, because you are an expert in what is sometimes called psychoneuroimmunology. And basically, it's not going that as far as mystical states, and you don't even have to, really tackle the issues of spirituality in a straightforward way. Even the mention of an active role of emotions and the way you reflect on your emotions on physical health may sometimes be perceived as something weird or maybe not that acceptable. What's your opinion on this?
This is an excellent question, and I would add to Mario's comments, and I should give a disclaimer. I'm actually from Montreal, and I graduated from McGill University. So, mais mon père était professeur à l'Université de Montréal. Alors, my father was a professor at the University of Montreal. Since this is the United Nations, I'll do my own translation. And I should say it is a great honor to speak at the United Nations on September 11th about this issue, which I hope will bring people of all cultures together and realize that we really are made of the same stuff. We are all made of the same biology and perhaps something that transcends it. And so I congratulate you and the organizers and the Noor Foundation for putting together this symposium. So I would add not only that there is a difference in the reaction of the scientific community depending upon culture, but also time. So in the area that I study, which is the science of the mind-body connection, the connection between the brain and the immune system, the mind, emotions, and our immune system and health, that field was disparaged when I first got into it more than 20, 30 years ago. The chair of my department when I was training in the United States said, "Esther, you're going to ruin your career by doing this." And I perversely didn't listen to him because I was convinced by the very point that you made. I was convinced by having seen a patient who had been perfectly well until he was treated with a drug that changed brain serotonin. This drug is not used anymore, but treated with a drug that changed brain serotonin, and he developed an autoimmune, scarring, painful disease. And that was, to me, such a powerful evidence that you can change the brain and have an immune response or an immune disease as a result, that I spent the rest of my career trying to understand the connection between the brain and the immune system. The resistance to this notion goes back hundreds of years, really to Descartes and before, but there always have been scientists at the edge of discovery who have bucked the dogma and who have courageously set out to address questions that the technologies of their eras could not answer. So, for example, in my book I described the anatomists of Padua, who were a breakaway group from the University of Bologna, where there was in the 16th century an edict against dissecting the human body by the church. And so this group of scientists and anatomists moved from Bologna to Padua and set up a hidden amphitheater to dissect the human body, like your hidden emails. And you can visit that today at the Palazzo del Bo. And so they managed to move the frontiers of science beyond where it stood by using the technologies of the day, the best available tools. And I think that just because our technologies today cannot answer these very complex questions that you have raised doesn't mean that the phenomena don't exist. But we can only, in scientific terms, take the answers as far as our technologies allow, maintain an open mind. And what I've seen in the 10, 15 years since the technologies have been available in my particular area, in understanding the molecules of the immune system and how they can affect the brain, so that when you're sick, you feel depressed, your memory is fuzzy, you lose interest in the outside world, and so on. We now have the technologies to understand this. We have the technologies to understand how hormones from the brain, nerve chemicals from the brain, can affect the immune system and therefore can affect maintaining health or causing disease. We have those technologies, and what I've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is a sea change in the audiences of scientists to whom I speak. 15 years ago, I was afraid to ask the question to a scientific audience, how many of you believe that stress can make you sick? You know, the scientists were stressed, although they didn't, they denied that they were stressed, just to hear that question. And now it's accepted. It's part of the dogma. And why is it? It's because we've been able to prove in the language of science that these phenomena that we all knew for thousands of years are real. We can show the molecules that make you feel sick. We can see the different parts of the brain that are activated when you feel sick. We can see what happens when you inject an immune molecule into the belly and change how the brain functions, and so on. That's not to say that that's the only way that we should think. I think it's wonderful to think outside the box. But if you're going to convince a large community of scientists, you need to use the language of science. And I have seen it happen. I have seen in this aspect of the field that I study a sea change, so that the vast majority of scientists and physicians now accept the notion that the brain and the immune system talk to each other, that stress can make you sick, that believing can make you well. That's a little more on the cutting edge and fringe, and not fully accepted yet. I won't say fringe, but some scientists think of it that way. But because of the wonderful researchers we have here today, and who'll be speaking this afternoon, and research by Mario Beauregard and Andy Newberg, and you know, the evidence is there to help scientists and physicians believe. And then I'm going to say one other point. From my point of view, coming at this as a physician, the wonderful thing about being able to prove to the scientific community and the medical community that these phenomena are real is now there is a groundswell of a movement in clinical medicine, bringing these principles into treatment. So what used to be called alternative medical therapies, meditation, prayer, yoga, tai chi, all of these are now called complementary and alternative therapies, and actually integrative medicine or blended medicine. And these approaches are now being blended into the conventional armamentarium of care and will, I'm sure, help people to maintain wellness as opposed, and in addition to fight disease. So there's a very practical outcome to understanding these phenomena.
Thank you. Well, it strikes me that, in fact, it seems that the common sense and what we sometimes call folk psychology that assumes that, yes, the way you think or your intentions and feelings have some kind of impact on the way you feel and the way your health evolves. I mean, the folk psychology assumed that these things were true. And what strikes me is that it's as if the scientific community was a sort of looming behind what we all know. You talked about a dogma, which is a very strong word. But in order to maybe zoom in and see, pick up some particular examples, you mentioned stress. I wanted, and this is really a suggestion from Dr. Schwartz, and I thank him for this. I wanted to show a few minutes. It's a footage from a bonus track from the movie The Aviator. Maybe you've seen it, and documenting the issue of OCD. Obsessive compulsive disorder. And also, I think it's a good way to start the discussion. It's a very clear and also very fairly complex issue that Dr. Schwartz has worked on these years, and I'm sure Dr. Stapp, who's a physicist, not a physician, will like to react to this, because he, as a quantum physicist, also reflected on the issue of OCD or free will or mental causation in general. So if everything's set, I'll start this. It's really two excerpts from this movie, from the bonus track. In the first excerpt, you'll recognize a famous actor who had to actually investigate the issue quite seriously. He documented himself. Maybe you've been instrumental in that. But, he'll explain it to you.
I really wanted to understand what it was like to have those rituals, to have these things that you need to play out in your own mind until you get that feeling of peace, basically. And that's what led me to work with a patient and really go through his daily rituals and show me how he actually washed his hands, what he would do, the actual science that went into this mental game that he had to play with himself.
Could you reach me a towel?
I really can't do that.
When I was working with Leo DiCaprio in Montreal, one of the scenes that we worked on was where Howard Hughes, he had to get blueprints from this other gentleman. His name was Odie. And I explained to him that what he could do is say, Odie, give me the blueprints. Odie, give me the blueprints. Odie, I need the blueprints. And he could break it up by saying words in between.
Show me all the blueprints. 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 Show me all the blueprints.
And that's what Leo was attempting to do, is he was trying to get the right feeling.
It's trying to find the right feeling. It's trying to, from what I understand in my research, it's trying to be able to put that sentence together in a certain, it has to do with phonetics and the way you say that, to have that sentence come out of your mouth the right and perfect way.
Nope. Maybe you've recognized someone. We'll let him comment later. The second extract is about patients who explain how hard it was for them to get rid of these obsessive compulsive disorders, these urges.
My OCD started, I would guess, in my young teens, and I was diagnosed, I guess, in 2002, I would guess. So I went about a good 30 years without being diagnosed.
Well, I probably had OCD definitely since childhood, but really it started getting worse 96, 97, 98, and there was no diagnosis because I didn't know what it was. It was just the symptoms were completely strange to me.
I first became aware that there might be something abnormal when I was searching out an abnormal psychology book. And I was reading about social anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, and I was relating to a lot of it.
Some of my symptoms, I think the contamination symptoms are ones that fortunately I don't have, but I have about everything else. Everything with repetition, whether it's saying things to people, having to sit down over and over. You know, if I sit down or step out of the shower, you know, I have to do it 10, 100 times until you get the right feeling. I have a concern that of hurting somebody, oftentimes leaving a store or any public place, have to look back or go back and kind of look in to be sure things are okay. Do that over and over again.
When I first started out, I had a little hair picking, and then I was afraid of sin. Whatever my definition of sin is, it's like I would spend hours and hours of praying. I would actually get in the prayer position sometimes at night and pray for an hour and a half, 2 hours, until I was so tired I couldn't be in that position anymore.
My whole life has been one of anxiety and concentration on dissecting things. Like right behind you right now is a poster, and my mind is dividing it and trying to get it into an order of symmetry.
In the new era going forward, the thing that's particularly powerful is knowing that you can use mindful awareness and you can use the power of focused attention to actually change the brain circuitry, and that when medication is used, we want to use medication in the treatment of obsessive-compulsive disorder in a way to enhance people's awareness, not just to treat symptoms.
In working with my own OCD, I had to make a decision for myself that I would be very proactive about my health in this area. I have a disorder, a serious one, a disease state of my brain that I need to be proactive about. So I want to be in control of part of that recovery and being able to live the rest of my life with some sense of normalcy.
Of course, you expose yourself on your own, but you're doing it mindfully, which means that you know, hey, I'm about to, get my hands dirty, or I'm about to make a right turn at the street. I know that this is a situation that causes a lot of anxiety for me because of OCD. I'm putting myself into the situation. I know I'm going to get the feelings, and I'm just going to go on and keep driving, or if my hands are quote-unquote dirty, leave them dirty because I know nothing's going to happen, and just keep going.
See it coming, feel it coming, anticipate coming, because I'll be in a situation knowing that this usually triggers an OCD symptom, and I figure, okay, it's coming, I know it's coming, so oh, there it is, it's coming, and then it comes, and then I say, okay, I can't do a compulsion, because the compulsion only feed into it. Mindfulness is a tool that I think that everybody should be practicing daily. It's knowing what you're doing while you're doing it.
The only reason I am here today doing this is hoping it will help someone. If someone can identify with this, they can learn that there's hope, there's treatment, so they don't have to live the life of torture that I have lived.
This is
what? That's the question. No, it's the OCD problem is really interesting, because typically here we have an instance of the way your emotional, mental life is largely determined by your brain, by some kind of dysfunctioning of your brain or neural networks in your brain. And the amazing thing is that Jeffrey Schwartz shows that exactly on this particular problem you can prove that there is something like mental force, so to speak, or the power of focused attention. So I'd like him to elaborate on this, because it's really at the center of our discussion. And maybe Henry Stapp will like to add a few words concerning the way quantum physics fits in the picture, which is not something very easy to understand, but I'm sure he'll do his best to clarify these complex issues. You could go first. Actually, it'd be interesting to have your physicist's opinion on the way OCD can help us understand mental causation.
Well, I think that I would like to build on what I would assume Jeff would say at the beginning, which is that his treatment, am I being heard here? That his treatment involves attention and mental focus. And the idea is that focusing your attention basically can cause your body, in particular your brain, to behave in a way that would not otherwise behave. And The classical idea of the mind-brain connection, which we've heard a lot about today, is that the brain really does everything. And the classical, by classical I mean the Newtonian mechanics idea of the universe that was essentially created by Newton and that existed unchallenged basically until the beginning of the 20th century, imagined the world to be a big machine. A clockwork world is what they called it. And so that was a very comforting feeling, and scientists could believe that we really have a very near to perfect understanding of the world. A famous statement by Lord Kelvin at the end of the 19th century said that we now understand all of nature up to the 4th decimal place or something like that. And so this is a very comforting feeling for scientists to be able to say we really understand things almost perfectly, a few little details. And well, that whole thing came crashing down during the first part of the 20th century when it was found by physicists doing experiments that that idea in principle could not explain data that that scientists were collecting, very robust data that was unquestionable. And so scientists had to change their tune. And now let me have a little bit of an aside and answer your question about how scientists are accepting these new ideas. The new idea of science was to bring a pragmatic approach into science. Pragmatic approach means you focus on what works, and you'll focus on what works in your life, and in particular there is a focus on consciousness, because our experiences is what we want to explain. And so whereas Newtonian physics gave you the idea that we understand the universe as it is itself, and we understand everything about it except kind of the fact that we're conscious of it. That's the part that's kind of left out. But the scientists weren't so much worried about that. And when quantum mechanics, when the classical ideas began to fail, physicists turned to a more pragmatic approach. I mean, the pragmatic approach says, well, at the bottom line, science is about the structure of our experience, really. And we create these theories in order to explain the structure of our experience, but experience is fundamental to science. Science is, the word comes from skio, to know. And so it's what we think we know. And so this change was a fundamental change in the perspective of science, which brought consciousness into the as the foundational structure of science. The structure of our experience is what we need to explain in science. And now, the question, these deeper questions, the question is, how do scientists view these deeper questions that we're trying to get into now? And there's a famous quote by Feynman, Richard Feynman, who said, "I don't understand quantum mechanics, and I don't think anybody understands quantum mechanics." And he's talking to his students at Caltech, and if you can possibly help it, don't try, because if you do, you'll go down the drain just like everybody else who ever tried. So that's kind of the attitude of most scientists, that this problem of consciousness, we know how the way that quantum mechanics was formulated at the beginning of the 20th century was in terms of a set of practical rules that work. And those rules allowed you to explain how your experiences were organized. And the way it was structured, it brought your experience into, human experience, into the dynamics. And that was the real change. Human experience was brought into dynamics. You often hear that the observer was brought into physics by quantum mechanics, but it was not a passive observer. The observer, in some sense, was always there. Somehow, we were somehow aware of what was happening. The whole dynamics, according to classical ideas, was a mechanical clockwork universe that somehow we were aware of. And quantum mechanics brought the human being into science not only as an observer, a passive observer of what was going on, but as an agent. And that is the key point. In order to make quantum mechanics work, you've got to bring the human agent into the equations of quantum mechanics, which are designed to explain human experience. You had to bring the human being into the dynamics at the outset. And the effect of this, and maybe in a later part of the questioning, I can get into more of the details, but in answer to this particular question here, the effect of bringing the human being into the dynamics of quantum mechanics was to allow attention, what you're focusing your attention on, to affect what's going on in your brain. And the other aspect of that is that the thing that determined the attention was not determined by the brain. Already beforehand you could think, well, there's just kind of a loop here. The brain determines what you're going to think, and it's just kind of a cyclic process. But the crucial point is that in quantum mechanics, there is nothing in quantum mechanics, as we currently understand it, that determines this, what the intention is going to be. So it's not just the machine is doing it all. There's something that's coming in that, according to current ideas, is not caused by the machinery. It causes the machinery to do something, but it's not itself caused by the machinery. So that's a huge difference. And the effect of it is to explain these OCD things that Jeffrey Schwartz will tell you about. It allows you to understand, really in terms of the equations of quantum mechanics. There's something maybe I'll talk about later, a quantum Zeno effect. I mean, we're talking about real equations that you can apply and understand. So you're really understanding these things, and you understand how your intent can cause your brain to behave in a certain way, and by making it behave in a certain way, as Jeffrey will emphasize, it actually changes the structure of your brain. And so you're changing the way you think in the future. And so maybe that's enough to say right now. The key point is that there is this gap in contemporary quantum mechanics, and this is the gap of what causes this intention to be what it is. And it's not caused by the brain, at least as far as we know in quantum mechanics today. So that's the point. It opens the door for something outside the brain to come in an essential way.
Maybe before we come back to OCD, just one point. I guess you were referring to the fact that the brain by itself, if such a thing as the brain by itself exists, is a superposition of brain patterns that somehow has to collapse into one particular pattern, and in order for this to happen, you need some kind of mental causation, or yes, is that the idea?
That's exactly the idea. I didn't want to know how far I should go, but to say a little bit more along those lines, you've probably all heard of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And so what used to be a very mechanical picture of the universe in classical mechanics has become smeared out because of this uncertainty principle. The physical representation of the system, or the representation of the physical aspects of a system by quantum mechanics, they have a wave function that represents the brain, for example. It's a smeared out thing. All these different classical probabilities or possibilities are all there on an equal footing. Now, we know that, for example, then, if I'm about to say something, there'll be a lot of different possibilities of what I might say. And then the way quantum mechanics works, there has to be this mysterious thing called the collapse of the wave function, or the reduction of the wave function. And what happens is this big smear of possibilities, or potentialities, suddenly gets reduced to something understandable. And that's essentially the point. This reduction is always to something that is associated with an increase in knowledge. So before there can be an increase of knowledge, there has to be a process that occurs where, and this is the process that's not understood, but it has to be, that's postulated in quantum mechanics, there has to be this decision as to what question is going to be asked, what new knowledge am I going to be able to gain? And so this is the collapse of the wave function that you're talking about, and that's the point that is something very new and different about quantum mechanics, and it opens the door because of the fact that there is the possibility of this, I say, each collapse is preceded by a human action that is supposed to define a possible increment of knowledge, a new increase in knowledge. These collapses are associated with human knowledge, and before you know what the collapse can be, before there can be a collapse, there has to be an action on the part of the person who's going to have the experience that defines what the new increment of knowledge is going to be. The wave function is a mechanical, mathematical thing that in itself doesn't have meaning or knowledge. And the act of the human being is in effect to say, I want to know something, and he wants to know something meaningful. So he wants to have it to be knowledge. It somehow has to be meaningful to the person. So you're getting this injection somehow from, we don't know exactly where, but in quantum mechanics, it's got to be there. This question has got to be posed. And once you say that the question is posed, once you just follow the rules of quantum mechanics, then you can understand how this thing from the outside is able to actually control your behavior. And your behavior then is going to control how your brain evolves and develops, and you're going to change your brain wiring. That's what Jeff is talking about repeatedly.
Your turn. We haven't heard you much, but I'm sure you have plenty of things to say about quantum physics and more.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a tremendous honor to be here. You know, I grew up in Valley Stream, just right next to Kennedy Airport, and I just went to a regular high school. I never had any private education. I mean, I'm just a regular guy from South Valley Stream, you know, and to be here on September 11th, talking to an audience like this, it is. I will remember this the rest of my life, and that is for sure. And the other point that, because we're limited in time, and obviously, and it's emotional for me to watch that movie shown in a location like this. I do have to I want to thank the 4 patients. Those are 4 of my patients who agreed to go. I mean, when they hear that they were shown at the UN on September 11th, to use a Jewish word, they're going to plot. I mean. because I mean, they never, would have thought that anything like this could happen like this, and it's why they did it, and as you can see, just to stress, how they worry. I mean, one of my 4 people, insisted on being in shadow. Well, I mean, he insisted on being in shadow because he was afraid that somebody was going to recognize him. He was going to lose his job. So. These things happen, and these people were all very courageous, and one of them, who looked like his life was completely spinning out of control 3 months ago, completed and got his PhD degree in economic history from UCLA. And when he was filming that a couple of years ago, I mean, you know, he was just getting to the point where he thought he might be able to go back to school and finish, and he did. And you know, so a lot has happened, and it has been due to a treatment I developed, and yes, it has a lot of philosophical implications, but all of that's been written in books, and there's no need, I think, to go over stuff that's already written in lay books right now, because there's just not enough time. I mean, you know, Henry and I have been working closely for over 10 years now. He's he's the best colleague I've ever had in my life, and become one of my closest friends in my life, and you know, and the method of treating your OCD is in a book called Brain Lock, which is now in its 48th paperback printing. So these things are you know, are easy enough to get. So I think it would not be an efficient use of time to start talking about that here and now, because there are some points that I want to say that are directly relevant to the United Nations and to world culture. And maybe the most concrete way to say it is that this is probably the first time, in fact it is the first time in my entire life, that I ever sat on a panel outside of specialty conferences that are just about consciousness, which are considered very marginal and do not have mainstream acceptance. This is the first elite location probably that has ever occurred where people like this can sit in front of an audience like this and say what we've said about how the fact that materialism is not true and the mind as a non-material force through focused attention can change the brain. It is radically new that we can sit here and tell you this. It has never happened before. And I want to stress another point. It's really, I can't, you know, seeing Leo DiCaprio, who I worked extremely closely with, I mean, again, if I had the time, even just that one scene that they showed of he was portraying Howard Hughes, a man whose life was ruined by obsessive compulsive disorder, and we spent hours and hours and hours just on that one little segment that you just watched, working together to get all the nuances right, and I wish I had the time to tell you more about that, and then how Martin Scorsese synergized the process. And it was a very, very interesting thing. And again, I'm just so happy that you could see that little piece of that. And maybe I'll tell one fast anecdote about Leo DiCaprio that'll kind of lead into where I'm going here, which and really does make the point. Leo DiCaprio so immersed himself into that role. And on the other, there's another 15-minute video after this one that you saw in which I talk about Mario's work in terms of how the mind can change serotonin and how actors, when they portray a role, actually change how their neurochemistry works. And he did this spectacular work in his laboratory showing that when actors portray a role, they change how the serotonin in their brain works. And to bring that point home to real life, Leo DiCaprio so immersed himself in this role to portray it and worked so closely and was so dedicated. I mean, you know, the nuances that he wanted to integrate into the performance, and that I very much believe he did integrate into the performance, resulted in the fact that for 3 months after the filming was stopped, he could not stop having obsessive compulsive disorder. So he actually induced in his own brain a transient case of obsessive compulsive disorder, which took several months for him to sort of recover from. And if that doesn't tell you how powerfully the mind can affect the brain and how much an actor can immerse themselves in a role, that it takes 3 months after the shooting is done to get out of the role and stop having obsessive compulsive thoughts, feelings, and symptoms, that is I think it itself is just a very, very powerful way of understanding how much focused attention can change the brain. And I want to say one other thing, just to contextualize this for you. You know, we've had some sort of very polite and, you know, lady and gentlemanly comment about the struggles we've all been through. We've been through intense struggles. Every one of us has paid serious career prices for the choices that we've made to say that the materialist paradigm needs to change. And Henry just so eloquently, and I'm aware of years of refinement that it's taken for him to take this very, very complex mathematics that he understands like very, very few people who have ever lived, and be able to talk to a lay audience and describe it in such clear terms has taken a huge amount of additional labor for him that he had focused his own attention on. But I need to tell you, because he never would, because he's too humble, that as cogent as what he was just saying to you is, and as necessary it is for us as a world community to translate our paradigm of understanding the relationship between consciousness and the body, consciousness and the brain, in ways that Henry just described, so that we can understand how focused attention changes our brain. Henry's view of quantum physics, which is the orthodox view, which is the view of the founders of the field of quantum mechanics, and let me stress this third point because it's the most important one, is the only way that quantum mechanics can actually be done. It's the only way that you can actually collect data in physical experiments that's ever been known and ever been actually practiced. And yet for all of that, very, very few physicists would sign off on what Henry just said. It's considered extremely controversial. And why? Because everybody in the scientific establishment is so dedicated. And in fact, they're following Albert Einstein in this, because Albert Einstein radically disagreed with what he just said. And Albert Einstein went to his grave not believing that the Heisenberg uncertainty principle was an actual principle of nature. He thought it was just a stopgap measure. And so we are still, as a community of a small minority of scientists who want to overcome this materialist paradigm, struggling with our lives, our careers suffer, our incomes radically suffer. We don't get anything like the kind of recognition from the mainstream media that the materialist community gets. So, I mean, it is an incredible honor to be here. It's also an incredible opportunity to be here. But I have to tell you that we are, you know, a small drop in the bucket still as we speak today. There is huge resistance among the mainstream scientific elite against granting the fact that materialism is not the ultimate truth. And let me say one thing, and then I'll bring this to a conclusion about why that's true. Because if what we're telling you up here turns out to be the case, and I think that already there's such a large amount of data that I think it straightforwardly is the case. And as I'm saying, as we sit here right now, it's still the only way the quantum mechanics can be done, and yet they still will do anything to deny that that's the case. And why? Yes, there are economic reasons. I have what I would call a balanced and pretty neutral view of the pharmaceutical industry. I am not anti-pharmaceutical industry, and I am not anti-drug, although my opponents try to describe me as that. It's not the case. But just the fact that I want to use pharmaceutical agents, that I want to use psychiatric medicines as a way to enable people's capacity to focus their attention more effectively so that they are enabled to change their brain, that view of using pharmaceutical agents, which I think most people would just say is common sense, of course that's what we should be doing, is considered radical, considered anti-establishment, and the notion of psychiatric drugs, and now they want to put electrodes, and are putting electrodes in people's brains, even though the neuroanatomy is not understood at any level that would justify putting electrodes in people's brains to treat psychiatric disorders. And yet it's being done, and it's being aggressively pushed by industry, by basically a collaboration of industry and elite science, who want to, on the one hand, push the materialist paradigm, and on the other hand, want to obviously make significant profits from the sale of these medical devices. And the point I'm making is this. Yes, on one hand, we're up against economic forces. On one hand, the materialist paradigm is viewed as, in some way, a key to how free enterprise economics operates, and it's certainly viewed as the key to how science operates. I actually think, and I am a strong believer in free enterprise economics. I mean, Adam Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was a prime inspiration for me in developing my method for treating obsessive compulsive disorder. The notion of the impartial spectator, which I'm sure many of you are very, very well familiar, is the core mental description that Adam Smith uses in the theory of moral sentiments to understand how we understand moral truth and how we can apply that understanding of moral truth to modify our behaviors. Reading that book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was absolutely a primary inspiration for me for developing this method of how to treat obsessive compulsive disorder. But so I am in no way an opponent of free enterprise economics. I am a strong advocate for free enterprise economics, but I deeply believe that materialist science is now obstructing a proper approach to free enterprise economics. And then I'll even for a Frenchman, this may be a little too radical, I understand. So
Esther has been wanting to
I'll conclude. I want to make one more statement, and then I'll just be done and hand it over to you. Although I think on clock time, I'm just about, I put my 10 minutes in and I'll be out of here. So the last thing that I want to say is, you cannot overestimate how threatened the scientific establishment is by the fact that it now looks like the materialist paradigm is genuinely breaking down. You're going to hear a lot in the next calendar year about Darwin and about how Darwin's explanation of how human intelligence arose is the only scientific way of doing it. If you take what Henry said as a physical mechanism, you can understand evolution and even Darwinian evolution. There's a big difference between Darwin's view and the neo-Darwinian view. You can understand that in non-materialist ways. And so my final statement is this. If the scientific culture is going to become a pro-human life, I won't say pro-life because I don't want to throw around politically charged terms, but a pro-humanity culture, it is going to have to deal with the fact that the materialist paradigm has broken down. And there are huge social resistances against recognizing that fact. And I'm asking us as a world community to go out there and tell the scientific establishment enough is enough. Materialism needs to start fading away. Non-materialist causation needs to be understood as part of natural reality.
Well, thank you. Esther Sternberg.
Well, with all due respect, I would like to bring the conversation back to a less confrontational approach. Again, I think because we're at the United Nations, that is how the United Nations was founded. I never found in the world of science, although my ideas, and it was mentioned at the beginning that ideas are as powerful and perhaps more powerful than anything else. My ideas were always at odds with the scientific community, with the dogmas of the scientific hierarchy. I had many choices at many points in my career to leave the scientific establishment, of which I am part. I'm at the National Institutes of Health. I don't think you could get more establishment than that. I chose to stay and to use a non-confrontational approach based on the best and most rigorous scientific evidence that I could gather at every point in time to establish my case, rather than to be confrontational. Because at the very beginning of my career, I was confrontational. And what I realized is that there is huge pushback from the scientific community, from any community. I'm sure in all of your fields of discipline, all of the areas that you're working in, which are so much harder to deal with than science, where we have something we can look at, measure, weigh, and touch. You all, I am sure, by virtue of the fact that you are here and part of NGOs and at the United Nations, I am sure that you all recognize that you may be passionate about a point, but if you don't ground that in solid, rigorous evidence, you're not going to get your point across. And it's hard to do that. It's hard. There's a temptation to give way to your passion. And but I have seen it work over a period of time, as I said, in the particular area that I work in, which is brain-immune connections. How many of you believe that stress can make you sick? Let's see a show of hands. Right, it's 100%. Well, 15 years ago, when I asked that of a scientific audience at the National Institutes of Health, only 30% of the audience raised their hands, and those 30 put their hands behind their back very quickly because they were afraid that their colleagues might see them believe in this notion. Well, how did that sea change happen? It didn't happen by me getting up on my bully pulpit and yelling at them. They would have run me out of the room. It happened by me and a group of scientists, ever-increasing larger group of scientists, toiling away and getting the actual evidence and publishing it and getting it out there in various forms to the scientific community, to the lay community, to these kinds of communities. And I think that's how we're going to get these points across. I also want to bring it, perhaps, do we have time? We started late, so I don't know if we can...
time because we don't want to end late.
Right. Well, what I just wanted to try to bring this back then to the scientific question that you asked, and that addresses the points that were made here, and that is whether it is something in the brain that creates this consciousness or whether it is something in consciousness that changes the brain, and I don't think we have the answer to that. But I can use the analogy, again, coming from my expertise of the immune system. The immune system is constantly surveying the surroundings. We're walking through a very dirty soup at all times. At every moment in the day, we are exposed to a myriad, to millions and millions of potential immune threats, toxins, bacteria, viruses, and so on. So the immune system is constantly surveying and reacting and responding to these threats. You're not at all aware of it. You're not at all aware of it until a critical mass of immune cells responds to a critical mass of viruses or bacteria or whatever it is. You have a strep throat. Then you become aware of it. You feel pain, you feel fever, you feel all those feelings that we feel when we are sick that we now know come from molecules released into your bloodstream that change the way the brain functions. So I do think there's a back and forth play between elements in the environment of which you are not aware, that change cellular mechanisms, that make cells release molecules, that in the brain make brain cells become electrically active before you are aware of it. And then you become aware of it. Now, how you define that, how you define what is consciousness and the point in time when consciousness arises, what critical mass is required of all these biological phenomena to the tipping point to tip you into that awareness, we don't know. We're beginning to discover. But I think it is a two-way street. I think that there are many phenomena that go on beneath the surface that eventually we become consciously aware of. And I do think that we can consciously, by conscious thought, affect those processes. We certainly know that in the case of, for example, meditation or prayer and yoga, Tai Chi, and its effects on the immune system. So there's no question that it can go both ways. We don't fully understand the details of how this happens, and I agree we don't understand causality. But I think that's the beauty of science and the beauty of research, that's where we always need these questions to keep us going, to keep us exploring the amazingness of the universe. And if we can keep it grounded in the commonalities between all of us, we're all human beings. We all have these brain processes. We all have these immune processes. And I hope that's something that can come out of this conference rather than a confrontational diatribe against any one group for any one reason.
Yeah, I don't think Jeffrey's intention was to confront anyone here, at least.
Just to get my intention, I don't think I was confrontational.
No.
I was assertive. I was not confrontational.
No, I think that was pretty clear. Also, Mario wanted to introduce a few concepts here.
Well, to come back to the question of how consciousness can influence brain events, I would like simply to note that during the last decade, there's been a series of brain imaging, functional neuroimaging studies that have been done by Jeffrey, done in my lab also, but in many other labs, showing that clearly intention can modulate brain activity in the brain regions and the neural circuits involved in emotion processing. And it's also been shown with respect to the placebo effect. So in the placebo effect, neuroimaging studies have shown that beliefs and expectations about various types of treatments can significantly influence the way the brain is functioning. So, in other words, mental factors like beliefs, desires, emotions, feelings can exert a very important influence on how the brain is functioning electrically and chemically. So it's something that is very important to remember and that can be used in everyday life.
We have a few minutes for questions. Before that, Jeffrey will kind of wrap up the whole thing briefly, of course.
Very, very brief. But your questions are extremely important, and I really want to hear your questions and comments. That's one of the things. I've been in many audiences, and they always say, was that a question? I go, no, that was a comment. I think comments are good. Comments as well as questions. So the point is, yes, I completely agree with Esther that we need to collect data. I mean, obviously, it's not science if you don't collect data. It's critical to collect data. The reason why all of us are sitting here at a scientific symposium is because we've all collected a lot of data and published it in top journals in our career. So that's not even open to question. Obviously, it's about collecting data. But I do want to say this very briefly. Theology will never be reduced to science. There's a lot of scientists who think theology is something that doesn't matter, it doesn't make sense, and we're way past that. I've spent the last couple of years of my life specifically studying theology, and particularly Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I want to tell you, science has a lot to learn from theology. And so I think we're now entering an era where science maybe can pull back its horns a little bit, get a little bit of institutional humility, not feel that it knows all the answers, and yes, we'll collect data, and yes, we'll explain things, but I think the time has come for science to say, you know, we're going to stop being so confrontational against other disciplines and accept the fact that it's not the ruler of the roost when it comes to the truth.
Well, that was a strong statement, but now we have a few, I didn't say confrontational, strong. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I just want to tell you, you need a mic, first thing, and second, you have to press the green button. So, yes, we have a question here. Where's the mic? Oh, the mic is, okay. So you have to press the green button.
There were two green buttons. I have a question for Esther. You were talking about biological, like a biological soup that we walk through that we don't have an awareness of. And I wanted to know if you distinguish in your work, clinically or research-based work, philosophically or theoretically, between the biological soup that we walk through that we're not aware of, or what Henry was speaking about, the quantum other, and whether that has any validity in terms of your patients, whether they experience something that comes outside of the realm of bacteria or virus, that's more theological.
So that's an excellent question, and I was focusing on the immune as an example of something we can get our hands on now. There's no question that we are exposed to all sorts of triggers in the environment, and the brain tends to focus on or tends to respond to more physical triggers, like what we can see in the visual spectrum, so what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we touch. The immune system responds to bacteria and viruses and toxins and so on, more chemical mediators. Each of these organs is set up to be able to have sensors that specifically respond to such triggers. I mean, we've worked it out for the visual system, for hearing, for smell, for touch, for the immune system. We've worked it out to a tremendous degree. That's not to say that there aren't other triggers in the environment of which we are not aware and which we do not yet have the tools to detect. For example, there's a huge issue now in mind-body medicine about energy medicine. We do know, of course, that there are electromagnetic waves all over the place. We know that some animals have electromagnetic detectors. We don't know if we do, humans, or not. This is at the edge of the unknown. It's not to say that such things don't exist. It's the approach from a scientific point of view is to develop the experiments to try to understand what other triggers might be out there and what other sensors we have in our body that might recognize them. So I'm open to the fact that there are many triggers in the environment that can affect both your brain and your immune system, all of it together, that ultimately change your mood, your memories, your cognition, all of which are very important aspects of self. We heard that earlier in the first talk. And so whether you're aware of these things or not, at every moment in the day, your sense of self is changing because of all these exposures. So for example, I mean, 100% of people in the United States and I don't know the percent around the world had some anxiety reaction to 9/11. And so any event that reminds you of that will bring back some of that emotional response even before you're aware of what it is that has triggered that reaction. So it is all part of yourself, and because we don't necessarily understand it doesn't mean it isn't there.
We can take two more questions, and please, I'm asking our panelists to be brief in their answers because we're running out of time. Thank you. This is one question.
Hello? Okay. So right now there's like very different approaches to consciousness. I mean, there's the reductionist approaches of people like Dennett, and then there's the more holistic approaches where consciousness is considered something much more fundamental in the universe. What are the kind of experiments, if they exist, that could even distinguish those different models of reality?
The line of inquiry is to demonstrate that perhaps mind and consciousness are non-local, if we want to use a terminology very similar to the one used in quantum physics. So, in other words, it's possible to demonstrate that mind and consciousness can exert non-local effects between, for instance, between humans at a certain distance, or between humans and animals, or even electronic machines. And so that's the goal of of psi research, or so-called parapsychology. And these type of studies have been done now for several decades. And they're still taboo among mainstream science. Yet, if you consider all the data that have been accumulated in this field of research, well, it seems clear that mind and brain cannot be mind and consciousness cannot be associated solely to the brain and the body, so they can seem to be able to exert an action, a non-local action. So that's one way of a line of investigation which is useful. Another investigation which is very useful with regard to this question is the kind of questions that Dr. Parnia this morning have presented. So, for instance, studying consciousness during cardiac arrest. So it's possible to demonstrate that, for instance, person undergoing a so-called standstill or surgery, when the heart is stopped and the body temperature is decreased, if it's possible for these people, while they are clinically dead, to be able to identify hidden targets, then that would be one way to demonstrate the fallacy of the materialist views regarding mind and consciousness.
Well, thank you. Since this was really two questions in one, I think we have to wrap up everything. And then, again, thank you to all the panelists, the audience, for this very stimulating discussion. And I guess the afternoon session starts at 2:15, so don't be late. Thank you very much. Thank you.